other guests in the main part of the hall who we're going to interact with. Sorry for the people in the public gallery, we can't interact with you, but we hope you follow our debate and our conversations in what is, I think, a very important issue for London and Londoners, to be honest. And I say that in a sense that we're actually still all EU citizens. And I think we should make that point very clearly. I just happen to be British EU rather than from another country. So can I welcome you again? So the main item of business today is our meeting, is where we will hear from expert speakers and invited guests on experiences of European citizens living and working in London. But first we have a few short items of formal business that we're going to go through. Please make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode and to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. So let's begin by doing that formal business. I just need to receive apologies for absence. I've got no chair's announcements, and I think I've received apologies from Peter Whittle and Gareth Bacon. Is that correct? There's no others. Okay, then I'm moving on to item 2. Members, if there are any declarations of interest that you need to make at this meeting? No, we've got none. And then item 3 on the minutes. Can we agree the minutes of the meeting of the working group held on the 15th of December 2016? Can I sign those off? And then item 4, can I welcome to what we've called this part of the meeting, European Voices, EU Londoners Speak. And so can I welcome some of our guests in terms of that? Samia Badani, Head of Campaigns and Stakeholders Engagements for the New Europeans organisation. I'll speak more of that organisation later on. Dr. Charlotte O'Brien, Senior Lecturer of York Law School. Christiane Link, Chair of Disire. Sunder Katwala, Director of British Futures. As well as Carolyn Downs, Chief Executive for Brent Council. Can I also welcome our invited guests in the main part of the Chamber and say thank you to the New European organisation who've been working with us in terms of today's event. Actually, you've done a fantastic job in reaching out to some of the participants here today, and we're very grateful. As I said earlier, the main part of this meeting is to hear about the experience from EU citizens living and working in London, following, and particularly their experiences following the referendum vote. Today's meeting is broken down into 4 sections. Section 1, access, advice and support. Section 2, hidden voices. Section 3, community cohesion. And section 4, the role of local authorities and the mayor. For each of these themes, we'll hear from one of our, well, probably 1 or 2 of our expert speakers, and we're trying to limit our comments because we want to make sure that we leave enough time for people in the main part of the chamber. I will open the session to Assembly members following the experts' views, and then we'll go to the open mic session, and then we'll probably come back to Assembly members who probably want to ask questions of people. Can I remind members of the public that if you wish to follow this debate on Twitter, it's at London Assembly. And if you want to take part in the meeting discussion using the hashtag European Voices, then you're able to do so. On the seats, I think in the main part of the chamber, you'll find a London Assembly comment card for you to add anything to today's discussion. But you'll also find an evaluation form for the New Europeans, and you're welcome to fill these and leave them on the chair at the end of the meeting. They will be collected. Now, can I pause for breath now and take a glass of water, because that seemed quite a lot to take in. Let's move to our first sections. And I just really just remind ourselves, as we remind our Assembly members, albeit my contribution wasn't short enough at that earlier stage, but we need to keep our contributions short and to the point so that we can hear as many people as possible. that guests remember that the committee and expert speakers cannot ask specific questions on individual cases. We can't do that, but certainly I think individual cases do highlight some of the problems that people face, and clearly we need to share those experiences, but also we need to focus on what is needed in going forward. That would help us in terms of giving and providing information to the Mayor of London, who meets with government officials, and any other organisations that we come into contact that we would seek to influence on this matter. So if I can begin then with the first section. Sorry, thank you very much. And in terms of the first section, I'm going to go to Samia. Samia, just to set the scene of where we are, can you provide an overview of the UK and the EU's proposals for citizens' rights, and outline the main differences between the two positions?
Thank you for having us. The EU proposal is based on the Commission's working paper on essential principles on citizens' rights, and there was a negotiating directive back on the 22nd of May. In a nutshell, what they propose to do is to guarantee almost all rights of EU nationals here in the UK, as well as UK nationals in the EU, namely that they will continue to exercise their rights and enjoy all the rights associated with their EU citizenship, as if almost Brexit didn't happen. The UK, on the other hand, has a different position on that. The UK seems to not have accepted the principle of acquired rights and is somehow making a distinction between certain rights which, in our views, are indivisible. It seems that the UK focuses more on our rights to stay post-Brexit, which we all knew we had anyway. The UK is proposing that EU nationals post-Brexit, when I say EU nationals, I'll tell you more about this cut-off date, which is a bit of a controversy, will be allowed to apply for a settled status. So we all thought, okay, maybe that's a new status. It's not such a new status. It looks like EU nationals, in particular Londoners here, will be entitled to apply for indefinite leave to remain, which is currently the type of permanent residency that third country national can apply after 5 continuous years here in the UK. This is concerning for many because currently EU nationals have a right under EU legislation to apply for permanent residency, and it looks like the UK is proposing that status and additional requirements which are yet to be seen. It's also concerning that the UK seems to say that the only people who are covered, who would be covered, are those who are in the UK after a cut-off date. Now, the cut-off date can be any time between the 29th of March of this year up to Brexit Day on the 29th of March 2017. It also covers only family members of EU nationals who are in the UK at the date, whatever date it is beyond cut-off date. On the other hand, the EU proposes that the agreement would benefit all EU nationals and their family members. The EU rejects this notion of a cut-off date because effectively it means curtailing rights of EU nationals before Brexit Day. And also the EU is a bit more ambitious and is prepared to guarantee the rights of future family members. And the UK does not accept that position. Now, we're a bit concerned that for the EU nationals who would fall after that cut-off date, because this group of EU nationals would have to apply for a temporary immigration status. Now, we can expect that would be some form of limited leave to remain, and any EU national who is in the UK after a cut-off date would have to apply for a brand new immigration status, the post-Brexit immigration status. So effectively what the UK is telling us is that we're not offering you anything new, because but we're offering you the possibility to apply to a status that's already in our UK immigration law. There's a lot of concerns amongst yourself, I'm sure, because our identity really is the rights that are associated with our citizenship right. And it means that after Brexit, EU nationals would lose completely their identity they will become third country national. And the UK said, well, actually, what we're giving EU nationals is they would be entitled to the same rights as UK nationals. That's not strictly correct, because UK nationals have the right to vote in general election. The question on the right to stand and vote in local and regional elections is still up in the air. We're not too sure whether this is going to be the case. And so what really the UK is offering is for EU nationals, certain EU nationals, depending on when they're in the UK, and their family members, again, depending on when the family members are in the UK, will be treated the same way as third country national with indefinite leave to remain, who in turn would be entitled to the same right as UK citizens. So that's the slight distinction that we are making, so that you can understand or you can evaluate whether the UK's offer is a fair or generous offer. So we also identified that by March 2019, about 500,000 of EU nationals would not have completed 5 years. So we have concern about this temporary immigration status yet to be determined. And even if you have acquired here permanent residency and you've got your certificate showing that, you will have to apply for this new settled status. So effectively, you lose your status on Brexit Day, and then there's a 2-year grace period in which you are guaranteed not to be removed. I'm not too sure about being detained in a detention center, but a 2-year grace period for you to apply for this permanent this settlement status. Now, in terms of practicalities, we're still waiting to hear more from the Department exiting the EU and the Home Office, because if you take somebody who has acquired permanent residency, currently you don't have to have any registration document to show that. So on the day after Brexit, now, provided that there's no agreement on a cut-off date, and we are talking about the 29th of March 2019. So you're an EU national, you've been here, let's say, 10 years, you've never registered with the Home Office, you're walking in the streets of London, and you are stopped and somebody asks you to provide evidence of your immigration status. So it's not too clear how would that work within that 2-year period, unless you are expected to have already registered somewhere. So we're very confused in terms of understanding how this would work in practice and the impact this would have on EU nationals. And of course, there's the issue of enforcement. The UK says that EU nationals will have the right to settle any litigation through UK courts, while the EU wants the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, the concern we have as well is that currently we understand that about 12 domestic legislation in the UK, on the face of it, are incompatible with EU legislations. I don't think this will be resolved by Brexit Day. So what happened then if the UK says that a qualifying person who could benefit from this agreement is not the same person that the EU thinks should be? So what we have is two different definitions or interpretation of who is a lawful resident. So you can imagine after Brexit the sort of difficulties that we're going to have. So that's where we are with both those offers. You've got the EU saying, look, we want to guarantee all your rights, and the UK that doesn't accept that acquired rights should be maintained, but that EU national will have a right to stay. And I want to have just a quick word on the 1.6 million UK citizens in the EU, our friends, who also we have as members, because now we are in this principle of reciprocity. So some people are for, some people are against, but it can't be a like-for-like system. So we're now in a situation where either the EU reduced down or the UK upped their offer. So that's a concern, and that needs to be addressed. And we have made representation to both the UK government and the EU decision makers, because bottom line, those UK citizens in the EU are union citizens the same way you are union citizens, and the EU will have, it's their duty to safeguard the interests of these citizens. So we are asking them to look at the impact this is having. And of course, what we've done in the last year is take examples, case studies from about 4,000 nationals, whether they're here or in the EU, and they're very concerned. And the anxiety they're in, I think some of our academics have said that it's potentially a violation of the right to private and family life. The uncertainty, and I think many people, many organizations, politicians, have always argued that the UK should give unilateral guarantees of all those rights. So we are in a situation where we have reciprocity. It's been a year. EU nationals are really anxious. From what we're hearing from the second round of negotiations, there's calls to be more anxious. So it's about really now, what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we make sure those EU Londoners can strive and could continue to live their lives? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that setting the scene. I want to just bring in Charlotte O'Brien. Give us a sort of legal, but make it easy for us to access, about the challenges that EU citizens and their families in London are likely to encounter over this period of time of what-ifs. And, you know, let's talk generally. This session is about access, advice and support. What is the right advice and support available there? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, really good questions, and to try and address those in 5 minutes is the academic equivalent of a Herculean task, but I shall plough on and rattle through what I think are some of the key challenges facing EU nationals. I mean, obviously, there are different challenges at different stages. So we've got the challenges that EU nationals are facing right now, and will be over the next 20 months. I keep on wanting to say 2 years, but I forget 4 months has already elapsed of our Brexit process. And then post-exit, different challenges again. The first most sort of tangible challenge, I think, is discrimination. And there's a combination here of direct and overt, and in some cases malicious discrimination that EU nationals are reporting, and we've seen the reports of hate crimes and so on. And then there's the sort of slightly less intentional, or perhaps more accurately less malicious discrimination that stems out of confusion. And that, I think, is likely to be a continuing problem. I did some scoping research recently to test the waters as to whether the referendum vote was having any effect on EU nationals' access to services, for instance, and found that they were suffering different treatment. They were having more difficulties than before the referendum in getting housing in the private rented sector, for instance, because landlords are more wary of renting to them because they don't know what the future holds. And of course, EU nationals are disproportionately concentrated in the private rented sector, in spite of what we might have been led to believe. In terms of banking, EU nationals are again reporting difficulties that they didn't have before the referendum. Opening bank accounts, getting mortgages, because again, mortgages are based on your future entitlements, and employment. So employers are increasingly wary in the recruitment processes of taking on EU nationals, but also employers who have existing EU national employees have been asking for documentation and all sorts of extra evidence of rights to be here of their employees that they have no basis for asking for at the moment, that the referendum has not created that need, and yet there's a lot of confusion over what the status of these people is. In terms of the next 20 months and beyond, the biggest problem that we have is that we don't know what the problems are going to be. There is so much of a lack of clarity that it's almost, it's very difficult to get a handle on where help is going to be needed. We have no clarity, we have no guarantees, and the withdrawal bill and the explanatory notes have made quite clear how few guarantees that we have, because it suggests that if there is no deal, the EU nationals' rights will potentially be unilaterally removed by the UK government under secondary legislation. Under the UK proposals, were they to go ahead, as we've heard, we've got a series of new statuses that have been created, quasi-new. And again, we're not, with each new status, and although there's been a lot of attention in the media on settled status, there's actually 5 statuses within that document, including the temporary leave to remain. And with each new status, there'll be concomitant new conditions and new entitlements that we don't know about. And there'll be a great difficulty of decision makers making sense of them, and of EU nationals knowing where they stand. And the temporary leave to remain is particularly problematic in terms of those people who might fall through the gaps, who for some reason may be deemed not entitled to welfare support, for instance, and therefore will find it very difficult to accrue the residence required to reach the settled status state. And the proposal suggests that all EU nationals will have to be processed in some way. Even those who have permanent residence, even those who've been here since year dot, if they're not UK citizens, they will have to go through some sort of processing procedure to be assessed. There will be no automatic right to reside, according to the proposals, that the documentation of that right, the assessment, will be constitutive of the right to stay. And herein lies what I consider to be one of the biggest problems, this massive administrative puzzle that is being posed. People have suggested that there's a potential of administrative chaos. I think there's a potential of administrative cataclysm. It's just pure congestion of the Home Office or whoever it is attempting to process 3 million people's statuses and adducing all the evidence that may be required for that. My research recently has shown, when I looked at the status of EU nationals and the problems that they were having during the 2014-2015 reforms to EU national entitlements, showed, unsurprisingly, that the risk of administrative injustice, the risk of having things go wrong, is much greater during a period of legal change, of legal transition. And we are facing unprecedented legal change, legal transition, the mother of all legal transitions. And so there is potentially, there are many opportunities for things to go wrong in terms of there being a lot of guidance that has to be produced for every single tiny change in provision, and decision makers not knowing what they're doing, they're not experts in the area, trying to make sense of all this guidance, some of the guidance likely to come up being inaccurate if it's produced far too quickly, a lack of capacity to deal with cases appropriately and comprehensively. And the principles of good administration, I think, are at stake here and at risk, the risks that things are dealt with efficiently and accurately and fairly. And this is in the context of an advice crisis. Okay, so the last couple of years we've had the Low Commission report on an advice deficit, and we've had Warwick Law School a report on an advice desert, and that's across the country generally for everybody, and it's exacerbated in the context of EU nationals, where the need for very specialist knowledge is particularly acute, and there is a dearth of expertise, certainly in the free legal advice sector. And this is in the context, of course, of there being very rapidly diminishing legal aid opportunities. So my 3 takeaway points are, first of all, we need to find ways to support advice organisations in monitoring experiences of discrimination that are reported to them from now and here on in. Because certainly for the next couple of years, they are unlawful and ought to be challenged, and there ought to be an information campaign on the equal treatment rights of EU nationals. We need, secondly, so we've had discrimination. Secondly, administration. We need evidence that the government is taking the principles of good administration seriously and think seriously about what it entails trying to reprocess and reassess 3 million people, and maybe reconsidering that and thinking about automatic rights for some people, or at least a vast commitment to an appropriate assessment process that has procedural probity. And third point is making sure that resources are directed towards those advice organisations who are going to be able to support and advise the vast numbers of people who are going to be feeling at a loss and not knowing what to do and not knowing what their rights are and not able to interpret the law, whatever the law turns out to be. There'll be a great deal of confusion during this period of change. Whatever EU nationals' rights are, those rights will be rendered meaningless if they're not administered properly and they're not enforceable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to take some questions from Assembly members. So starting with Andrew Dismore.
Yeah, well, it's just for me picking up the point that Charlotte's just made. Because I remember when I was an MP not so long ago, more than a third of my casework was immigration and asylum claims at that time, based on the present law. And I don't think that's changed very much. And we certainly see huge delays administering the existing system. So I can't see the government in any way, shape or form being able to tool up to deal with million Londoners or 3 million people altogether, no matter how simple the system is. I mean, we've already got years of delay in the existing system for people from the Commonwealth or wherever applying for indefinite leave to remain, or indeed EU nationals applying for British citizenship now. So I can't see any prospect, realistically, of the government being able to do that. The other point was about I think it's the point that you're making about the ECJ jurisdiction. I suppose one option, assuming we don't opt out of the Charter, is the European Court of Human Rights, effectively becoming the fallback on the Charter on issues like family life and so forth. But the problem there is, of course, they're not tooled up for mass claims in any way, shape or form, with the delays of many years in processing cases. But that could be a result. That could be an answer to the jurisdictional issue as a compromise. But they would then have to tool that up, and I don't see them being able to do that. So I suppose my main concern is if we do have this new status, whatever it happens to be, the government, it's not going to be a cataclysm, it's just going to be a complete meltdown, which is virtually where we are already, with the existing immigration demand, which won't go away. I think we need to remember that only half the migrants in the UK are EU nationals, the other half are from all over the world, and they've all got to have their status sorted out as well. There doesn't seem to be any desire to remove or reduce immigration from the rest of the world.
Jeanette Arnold.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Can I just go back to Samia? Thank you for that exposition. And it's great that we're live and that the information that we'll gather here today will be there as a resource, because it's so needed, that the depth of information you shared with us. I just wanted to know whether your work had covered, in fact, reciprocity. Because you talked about our government's position, which seemed so outlandish and so crude and so out with understanding. You know, how could this be, given that we have Brits abroad who surely there will have to be negotiations about their rights post-exit?
I think the EU is quite ambitious, and what they offer is nearly unilateral guarantees. They accept that UK citizens in the EU and their family member and future family members, those who are in the EU, their rights will be guaranteed for life. Mm-hmm. So somehow it moves away from reciprocity, because the EU is saying to the UK, look, this is what we're offering, that both groups of mobile citizens keep their rights as if Brexit never happened. Mm. And the UK is taking a completely different approach. I think one thing I forgot to mention, there's some good points in the UK proposal, is they seem to accept those bilateral arrangements in terms of exportability of benefits, recognition of degrees. But again, our view is they need to abandon the cut-off date, because you could have a British national in Germany who arrived yesterday, and if they fall after the cut-off dates, they'll have no rights guarantee. So this is the opening position from the UK. So now we're a bit in a tricky situation, because what happens next? Because the EU has said it. UK nationals in the EU will have the same rights as they currently enjoy, or the rights that they're about to enjoy, which is even more generous. And UK has started from a really lower position, or a completely opposite position. So this is where we are.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for that.
Charlotte, do you want to come back on the issues that Andrew raised, particularly about jurisdiction and one of the proposals that Andrew commented? Do you want to comment on that? So I think he was commenting, saying that actually a compromise might be the European Court of Human Rights rather than... Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I think that the European Court of Human Rights has not been politically any more popular than the European Court of Justice. I think it will be an odd switch to have.
But the difference is we will still be a member of the Council of Europe.
Yes.
We won't be a member of the European Union.
Yeah, so,
So it's not a question of popularity, because they're both equally unpopular for people who are ignorant of what both courts actually do.
yeah.
But the fact is that we would get over this argument about not being in, yet still subject to jurisdiction of the ECJ, whereas it would be still in the Council of Europe, because I can't see us at the moment, though you never know what may happen, same with coming out of the Council of Europe.
I think it would be tricky to have the European Court of Human Rights be somehow responsible for arbitrating between the EU and the UK on a matter that's not really part of the convention.
But it would be between the individual and the,
Yeah.
and the UK.
Yeah.
Like at the moment, the ECHR does a lot of immigration cases, one sort or another anyway, as against an individual and the UK government, indeed governments around Europe.
But I mean, I suppose part of the controversy about the jurisdiction of the ECJ is about arbitrating whatever the agreement is going to be, and there the EU is a party, and there you're not really dealing with convention law. Though I take your point that the argument about Article 8 rights, for instance, could certainly be.
But it would be justiciable.
It would be justiciable, yes. I'm just not totally convinced that it would be considered to be a particularly strong claim under convention law. But I think essentially what is at risk here is a series of rights that would be agreed between the EU and the UK. Of course, if EU nationals become effectively third country nationals, then you're dealing with immigration law, and then you're dealing with Article 8 triggered as a consequence of that.
But also, even if the agreement, such as it is between the UK and the EU, sets out certain rights and obligations, whatever, if those don't comply with Article 8, there is still a fallback position for anybody, even if it's not covered by the agreement, to go to the ECHR to say my article rights have been infringed, even if it's out with whatever the agreement, whatever the treaty obligations are.
Of course, the problem arises if the agreement, whatever it is, recreates or replicates the situation that exists for third country nationals in the UK generally. That it's not going to be, I think, something that the
Yeah, but the point is that even those third-party nationals, sorry, last point, those third-party nationals now have the right to go to ECHR.
I think this is it's going to be a very interesting point. It's going to be one where we're not going to know the outcome of that, because that'll be part of some of the negotiations that come up. But in terms of options, these need to come out into the open, I think. The earlier the better.
Could I just add one thing? And again, that's why I briefly mentioned the constraints with this principle of reciprocity, because you'll be in a situation where UK citizens in the EU post-Brexit would fall under the Court of Justice jurisdiction, and EU nationals here not, they wouldn't. So you see the problematic that would have.
Dual jurisdiction.
Yeah, the dual one.
Okay. Other members, or can we move into the main? Right, this is the chance where the little audience here in the chamber, anyone who wants to ask some questions of our guests, expert guests, or make a statement about some of the issues they've heard. You're under no pressure to, but we'll take you and we'll try and fit you all in. Yep, we've just got a mic for you.
My name is Emmy van Deurzen, of Dutch origin. I've been in the UK for 40 years. I am a professor with Middlesex University. I run a postgraduate college. I'm also vice chair of New Europeans. I am extremely concerned about the mental health problems with EU citizens, which are very serious indeed. For the past years, I have been in touch with literally hundreds of EU citizens who are breaking down and who can't get the support for that, because none of them dare use the NHS anymore if they're, having this business about having health insurance has become a real problem to them as well. So what we're actually seeing is a scale of a problem that will hit us later on and that we should be very ashamed of, allowing this to happen. There's 3 million people in this country who came here in good faith, who made their lives in London, as we're speaking here in London, and who trusted that the pledge that was made to them would be lifelong, and that the families and the houses and the businesses they created would be safe and secure, and that all of their family would be part of that, and they would never find themselves in this situation where suddenly all of that has been taken away from them, and for more than a year they have been in this state of mind where they expect the worst, where their children are being asked to acknowledge that they have parents who are foreign suddenly, when we were all equal with the Brits for many years. We were friends, we were trusting, and suddenly we have been removed from that status, and we have become second-class citizens who are now looking at the possibility of becoming third-class citizens, and it is just unconscionable. I just cannot believe that we haven't made a bigger scandal about it all, because it is totally unacceptable. And in London, where 85% of people voted to remain in the EU, we should show the country how it is done. We should support these EU citizens much more forcefully. And I could give you many things that we can do straight away. We know we're very lucky to have Carolyn Downs from Brent Council, which is the one council that set up some services for EU citizens, and I hope we hear about that soon. But every council should prioritize services for EU citizens at many different levels. We need places where we can invite our fellow EU citizens to give them information, legal information, mental health information. We need to get them to be in workshops with each other so that they can mutually support each other. We need much more education about what is actually going on, what they can do, what recourse they have. None of that is happening. Nothing's happening. These people are isolating themselves. Some of them are saying, I don't dare going out in the street anymore, because when people hear my accent, suddenly they start banging into me. People talk about their cars being destroyed or mud being put on them. This is unbelievable. These 40 years I have felt at home. This is what all of the EU citizens are saying. I felt at home here. This was my country of choice. I put my roots down. This is my home. And now I cannot consider myself welcome anymore. I cannot even feel safe anymore. What are we together going to do about it? We need your support. We really need your support. We need you to hear us loudly and clearly. This is not acceptable. Please. Thank you.
We're going to hear more of that about from Carolyn at the end of one of our sessions about what can local authorities and mayor does. But I've very much heard about the inconsistency of where people can go and that signposting at this period of time. Other contributions, colleague there?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd like to say is that it's not just EU nationals, there are EEA and EFTA nationals who are involved. There are obviously not quite so many of them, but I think about 30,000 in the UK as a whole. So people from countries such as Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and I think about 30 from Liechtenstein, who are all here exercising their treaty rights, essentially, although the legal basis is slightly different, I guess. But and the only thing within the UK's offer about that was that there'll be a similar arrangement, which doesn't really say anything at all. But I work for an organisation called the European Citizen Action Service in Brussels, and we actually do offer free legal advice to not just European citizens, but all across Europe, in all the member states, to people exercising their free movement rights. And we also have something called the EU Rights Clinic. We work on similar cases, more complex cases, and we have found that people are, very very concerned about Brexit. Initially, they were concerned just generally about Brexit. More specifically, recently, a lot of people are really concerned about residency. And I think there's generally, I mean, a lot of this stuff about comprehensive sickness insurance has only got in the news recently because of Brexit, but it goes back at least to 2012 when the Commission actually identified that it was a problem. But they haven't done anything about it. And I think generally...
Could you explain what exactly the problem is, because it's quite confusing.
Well, with comprehensive sickness insurance, well, it's usually reported on when people apply for permanent residency. They're told they haven't necessarily been legally resident here because they, within the, I think it's the Citizenship Directive, people are entitled to permanent residency after 5 years if they have had comprehensive sickness insurance. I think it's people who have been working for most of that time are generally okay because they've been paying into the paying national insurance. But people such as carers, students, people who have worked and not worked, and in those sorts of situations, and people who, who stay at home, whose partner goes out to work, they're the kinds of people who are being turned away, or who are being turned down for permanent residency because of this comprehensive sickness insurance. And there's also access to benefits as well now. Has a similar requirement. It's often people in surprise, you'd be surprised, you'd think they've been here for 14, 15 years, but because they haven't consistently been working or they've been studying at various times, they're being told now that they haven't really been legally resident here, so they're not entitled. I think generally there's for EU nationals here, and the EEA nationals, there's a general level of mistrust or distrust of what the UK's intentions are. They try to make it sound like a fair and generous offer when really it's a negotiating tactic. And from what's gone on, people who have permanent residency now will have to reapply, as was already said. So people just don't really know what their situation is. We also recently had a survey of UK and EU nationals actually who are affected, but for EU nationals, 86% of them felt personally affected by Brexit. Many people felt less aware of their rights than they were before the referendum, I presume because they are now actually looking at what their rights really are. And a lot of people are getting more politically active, and so what we're trying to do is to sort of raise awareness more generally of people's rights, so that people people know where they can go to, people know what they're entitled to, and people can actually go to their political representatives and say, what is being done about this and what is being done about that. And some of our partners here today, actually, we work with the Law Centres network now in providing legal advice in London. So I think there are law centres in Harrow, Islington, Lambeth, and Southwark, where people can go to receive advice. And as well, we have a service called the Europe Advice and EU Rights Clinic. So anybody who needs advice on on Brexit, then they can always come to us. So I think generally the government needs to do more to sort of regain people's trust, to make people, give people some certainty as to what their rights are going to be, what their status will be. I think people need to know that even if there is no deal, which is looking more and more likely, that their rights will still be guaranteed regardless what happens in negotiations.
Thank you for that. Colleague there, just in front.
Thank you very much. Władek Mierendrzejowicz, Federation of Poles in Great Britain. I'd just like to point out that of the 3 million people spoken of, possibly up to 1/3 are Poles. Certainly, thank you. Thank you for the previous 2 presentations. I think it is very important that reassurance be given, and if the government isn't giving it, then reassurance from local authorities in the form of various helps will be extremely helpful. Particular problems are children being discriminated against in schools, something to help the children feel that they are at home. And a second problem is that so many Poles feel that they'll simply be leaving Britain in the next year and a half because they don't know. And why not go back to Poland, where the economy is at present growing? One can't guarantee anything. But it will be a loss to London and to the country as well if emigrants who have been here for 5 years, have settled, have set up businesses and so on, suddenly start leaving. So the reassurance from local authorities will be welcome, and it will probably be economically helpful because it will stop the loss of people who are in many cases important. Thank you.
Okay, colleague there, don't rush away. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Lara. I am an Italian citizen, but I also work for Liberty. And one of the problems that we have seen is to add to the theme of mistrust. I don't know if you are aware, but there are several secret agreements between departments of the government regarding data sharing. And it has become a real matter of concern, including to European citizens that are also covered by these agreements. So the Department for Education can share information with the Home Office for immigration purposes, for immigration enforcement purposes. And the same thing regarding the NHS and the Home Office. And that has resulted, we are told by many stakeholders that we have contact with, in people being afraid of accessing schools and accessing health. Obviously, there are lots of problems related to that. And the government will not give, and has not given, an assurance that EEA nationals are not going to be covered by that, and that's a great matter of concern. In particular, there are the problems of children who may be the children of EEA nationals, even more so now that the government is saying, we don't know if you are here lawfully, if you're not working. That adds to the issue of the sickness insurance. So someone who has been just a student, or someone who has been a job seeker, or a pensioner who doesn't have comprehensive sickness insurance, the government may say it's not here lawfully and may try to remove these people by having data sharing agreements. In fact, the government is already trying to remove lots of rough sleepers. It may be something that you are aware of. And Lambeth Law Centre, which is one of the law centres that has been assisting these EA nationals, has issued several cases, but also other legal firms. And I've read some of those cases, and they are shocking. Some people who have fallen on hard times, people who are not, as the government likes to put, professional rough sleepers, who would want to be a professional rough sleeper, people who have fallen on hard times and who are just being shopped to the Home Office, detained, sometimes not being informed about their rights of appeal. So I think that that's a matter of real concern, and in particular, insofar as these secret agreements are concerned. When I say they are secret, I am not exaggerating. They are not publicly available, and they just become available when Freedom of Information Act requests are made, and sometimes after months and months and months. So I think that this just adds to the feeling of insecurity that EA nationals have been under.
Right, I think there's some very important points there. We're capturing those. Of course, this session is being recorded. So in our way that we record, our meetings are word for word. As you've said it, it will appear in the minutes. So that's why we're not rushing to take notes and only small bits. So we will think about that. We're going to return to advice and support in probably our last session and come back on that. Is there anything you want to say, Assembly members, at the moment? Is there anything that you feel that you urgently want to respond to that you've heard? Yep, Charlotte?
A brief point about what we've heard about the people who are falling through the gaps. I mean, that definitely echoes my experience, because my research, I've been working with EEA nationals, thank you for the correction, in a Citizens Advice Bureau, and giving secondary advice to people around the country. And time again, and this is what concerns me about the temporary status that's being proposed, which will be subject to the same conditions as these people are already exposed to, time and time again, it's women and children that are falling through the gaps, people who've been here resident for a very long time. And there was a case recently in the upper tribunal in which a child, a 17-year-old child, had been born in the UK, she'd lived in the UK all her life, she'd never lived anywhere else, and she was found not to have a right to reside. You know, and that's because a right to reside is about having worked. And you don't expect a child to work, and yet she was being punished for not having worked. And she'd been abandoned by her mother, who'd moved to a third country, so it wasn't as though she had a connection with another EU nation to go to, or another EEA country to go to. And women keep on falling through, partly because of this broken status that they've had in the past. If they've had a period of work and it's been broken by childcare or other caring arrangements, but also because increasingly in the past couple of years the government has been redefining what counts as work. And so people who fall below the minimum earnings threshold, even if they're working as much as they can around their childcare responsibilities or elderly care responsibilities, if they fall below that threshold, which amounts to, or certainly a couple of years ago, amounted to 23 hours at the minimum wage, are then being defined as not being workers. And so that whole past period is being negated and wiped away, and they're being told, actually, you're not entitled to benefits or to permanent residence or whatever it is. And that's problematic because it's potentially discriminatory, because no such, there is a sliding scale of what's expected of work in terms of UK nationals if they've got childcare arrangements. And there's no, or if they have disabilities, and there's no sliding scale on for either of those when it comes to the minimum earnings threshold for EEA nationals. And that's an area that I think is deeply problematic and is likely to be problematic looking forward. And that's why I'm concerned about the possible perpetuation of conditions that serve to exclude women and children of considerable periods of residence. I'll stop speaking now, but I've had clients who've been working for 20 years, for 33 years, and one who'd been in the UK for more than 50 years who was told she did not have a right to reside. It's sort of nonsensical, really, when you think about it.
Chair, can I just come in here and just say, especially to the Professor, and thank her for articulating it. And it just had such resonance for me as a constituent member for Hackney, Islington and Waltham Forest, and for all of my 17 years here and before as local authority members. These are the stories that I've been receiving in my case work, and that the MPs, Diane and Jeremy and others, have been dealing with. This is the experience of those migrants from outside of the EU. And you pointed out something that I don't think is so widely known, that the draconian measures that have been brought into the Home Office over the last 10 years are really what we will have to be asking for that to be withdrawn. And I think it's just showing what a mountain there is to climb.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to the second session, which is called Hidden Voices, and my colleague Caroline Pidgeon is going to ask some questions around that.
Yes, I'm going to lead off on the first one to Christiane. I wonder if you could, we've already heard a bit about the new conditions around 5 different sort of categories of status. We've already heard from one of the members here today about people feeling like they're second-class, third-class citizens. Can you outline which groups of EU citizens are likely to face particular challenges when it comes to navigating the processes that are set out in the government's policy paper?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Desire, the organization I'm the chair of, is a newly founded organization of disabled Europeans and other disabled people who live in the UK. We are the voice of disabled EEA and European Union citizens. Some of them are unable to obtain permanent residence in light of Brexit because they are unable to work and do not meet the criteria because of this. We also campaign for carers from EEA countries who provide full-time care for their disabled relatives, and they're often caring for British citizens, in fact. EEA nationals who provide such care for their family members are often unable to assert the right to residence because the Home Office does not consider them as working persons exercising treaty rights. They're also, I want to correct the comment made before, they're not considered as self-sufficient. So even if they have CSI, Comprehensive Sickness Insurance, it wouldn't help them because they are in fact not self-sufficient under the regulations. Disabled Europeans in Britain are facing a hostile environment at the moment. They are considered as unwanted by at least part of the society. They are not only labelled as immigrants, but often labelled as burden to society as well, because they receive disability-related benefits, for example. Even in the first couple of months after we started Disire, we can't comment on anything without receiving comments like, you only came here for the benefits or to use the NHS. Even so, a lot of disabled people live here for decades, and in other European countries there are health systems and benefits for disabled people as well. On Facebook, many Europeans start their post when they're asked for advice about their status with the words, "I never received any benefits in the UK," as if this is an achievement, but it also shows how difficult it is to say at the moment, yes, I'm receiving benefits. It only means they never had any life-changing car accident, they didn't become a crime victim, they didn't get cancer or have any other impairment. It's not an achievement not receiving disability-linked benefits. We hoped very much that the start of the Brexit negotiations would calm down and clear up the situation for us a little bit, but unfortunately the proposal recently presented by the UK government concerning the right to stay for EEA citizens does not make any mention of disabled people or carers and is extremely unclear about the requirements for the new status. The Home Office has not defined what residence means. It is unclear if it means presence in the UK, which most disabled people and carers could fulfill, or if it means that a person must be present and exercising European Union treaty rights, working. It is always mentioned be living and working in the UK, which is a concern to us. If that is the case, then this would make it impossible for many disabled people and carers to obtain even the new proposed status. It's also not clear if the receipt of benefits, the receipt of carers allowance will play any role in the future. We welcome the intention to scrap the CSI requirement, even so this move would not help most of disabled people and carers who receive carers allowance or disability and other benefits, as they are not considered as self-sufficient. The grace period would not help them either, as their impairments are permanent and they cannot change the fact that they are disabled in 2 years' time. We also are worried about what will happen to non-EEA family members who are married to a disabled or terminally ill EEA national who might pass away before the 5 years of residence has passed and without a chance to use the grace period due to their partner's early death. We have just been contacted by a European Union national with cancer who is worried about what will happen to his non-EEA wife if he passes away before Brexit. So people are very anxious and worried about the future, and they have the feeling they're losing control and can't do anything about it. Disabled people are often unable to meet the income threshold as stated in the Immigration Act. If a new threshold is implemented for EEA citizens who want to live with their partner or family member in the UK, there must be provisions made for disabled people who are unable to meet the requirement due to their impairment. In general, any new arrangements regarding the right to stay in the UK for EEA citizens must not discriminate against disabled people and their carers. Both the United Kingdom and the European Union have signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. Disabled people might need help to apply for any new status People with visual impairments, learning difficulties, and other impairments might need help to fill in forms and collect evidence to prove their status. So the council get a vital role to support them in the future if any new system is implemented. I personally have just applied for British citizenship and had to do an English test and a Life in the UK test. When I called up one of the centres to ask them if they are accessible, they immediately cancelled my test and told me they have to do a risk assessment first if I'm allowed to do the test there. I had the feeling I'm the first wheelchair user ever doing an English test in this country. And things like that must not happen to any other Europeans. You really feel you're a second-class citizen, and even if you jump through every loop they're giving you, every test you have to make, then at the point where you mention you're disabled, they say, no, we never had this before, it's quite difficult, and it was a very unwelcoming experience. I had to reschedule the test, and I don't want that any other disabled person experience the same when they go to council office, to wherever they have to go in the future to secure their status. So when people have to apply for new status, have to visit offices, or whatever the new conditions will be, the process must have disabled people in mind. Of course, we would prefer a process, as mentioned before, when nobody has to apply for anything, and this was the case in the past decades, and we Europeans will get treated the same as before, means equally to British citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. The more we hear this afternoon, this doesn't represent, the country I live in and believe in, and as many of us around this table our beliefs. This is quite shocking to hear the reality on the ground of such a decision. Caroline's going to do my next question because I'm afraid I have to slip away for childcare reasons. But thank you all for coming. It's been really a very interesting hour so far.
Thank you. So the second question in this section on hidden voices is for Samia Badani, which is what specialist provision is required to support vulnerable EU citizens, and who is best placed to provide it?
Thank you. Amy's done my job. I think she gave a passionate speech in terms of from a mental health perspective, and I think in the past year we haven't highlighted the issues enough, as if they assume that it's okay to day in, day out, not to know what your future holds. And I think we're starting to see the impact this is having on the mental health of EU nationals. Now, we understand that local services are overstretched. There is going to be a need for provision of those services. And I think it's quite, we should, and London Assembly should recommend that appropriate resources are put in place, and looking at different different models of service delivery for these EU nationals, by EU nationals, and look at how you can target them. Because one thing we haven't said enough is that these EU communities are hard to reach communities, and often in different in different London boroughs, they're not engaged with local services. So that's something that needs to be done as well in parallel. What we've done here with New Europeans in the last 3-4 years is to encourage the democratic participation of EU nationals, and it's coming, we're seeing people more involved because it's about cohesion, it's about building those stronger communities, and it feels that the work started with EU nationals, and then the referendum came, and it's all interrupted, and we are getting these integrated. So I think there's a lot to do, a lot of work to do around this, especially that we know EU nationals no longer feel welcome here. So you can imagine the sort of impact this is having on families, on children, and on all individuals. I want to go back to your point, Laura, on the Home Office data sharing. We met with the Immigration Minister, and the good news is that they want to streamline, but I think there need to be a bit more scrutiny, because the burden of proof is shifting to them accessing the information, and ultimately they will access information from local authorities. And back in 2013, the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police began this Operation Nexus, which targeted EU nationals, especially the ones who were homeless and hence didn't have a right to reside. And again, that was data sharing. And we know in London, we know the housing crisis we have in London. We know that EU nationals mostly live in HMOs, in housing multiple occupation, with little security of tenure. So we recommend that there's more efforts to try and make sure that they don't lose their homes, because if they become homeless and they try and access local authority services, and for some reason they're not assessed properly, and somebody says, well, you don't have a right to reside, well, after Brexit, it means a lot. So people could potentially end up in detention centers. So it's about strengthening those communities, keeping their lives stable, looking at their housing environment, but also ensuring that there's access to school education and that people are not faced with discrimination. Of course, access to legal advice, but not simply legal advice, information services. And I think we do believe, having worked with EU nationals over a number of years, they have the skills that just need to be empowered. So and I think it's the lack of information. What we mustn't do is to think that it's okay for information to be accessible online. That's not what's needed because of the current state of anxiety. And we know that, government services, even local authority, prefer delivering advice services through digital channels. So it's difficult in the context where EU nationals are. And you can read 20 fact sheets that tell you everything, but if you're anxious, you will not comprehend that. And what we mustn't underestimate is the generational gap between different EU nationals. You've got EU nationals who settled here 20 or 30 years ago from different community, from different member states who do not necessarily speak English and who do not completely participate. So one wonder, how do we reach them? And there must be a specific engagement strategy by local authorities to help and to provide the support that they need. So a bit more digital inclusion as well, and the emotional support. I think I'd like to hear more from those who are more affected in terms of what they could tell you.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's absolutely devastating testimony that we've heard from both of you, and the idea of people who are unwell and worrying about what's going to happen to their partner if they don't live beyond the Brexit date is just unbearable. And the idea of people, not having to do a risk assessment to allow you to do the English test. I mean, it's absolutely shameful that this situation is like this, but I completely agree it would be very good to hear now more from the floor.
Jeanette, are you, the questions you want to ask?
No, thanks.
Fine, open to the floor again. I'll take people. We'll start at this end. So the woman in the blue top.
Hi, my name is Anne, and I'm an EU migrant from Denmark, and I also work for an organisation called Migrant Voice. We work with migrants from around the world, but also a lot of EU nationals, or EEA nationals, I should say. When I was thinking about what to say, I started by thinking, well, I feel like I should say something different. I want to add a new point because I think I don't want to keep repeating the same points. And then I thought, well, actually, there's a reason why we keep repeating the same points as well, because we're affected by these issues, and many of the issues affect us in the same way. And I wanted to start by saying, what's been said about the level of uncertainty and how you feel suspended in uncertainty and being told that, don't worry, there'll be some kind of solution for you later, and we'll tell you the details later, and how that impacts on your life, in your personal daily reality. And I'm speaking as someone who probably could get status if I applied for it. Now we don't know what the new rules for settlement are, so I don't know, but under the permanent residency I probably could have applied. And I feel a great level of anxiety. So my concern really is for the people who are not in a position where they feel that probably I will fit the qualifying criteria, because I work with many people who, as we've heard today, have maybe been here for 30 years, but I haven't been working consistently because I've raised children. And people have lived full lives here, feeling at home in this country, but just don't fit into this idea of what a qualifying criteria is. I want to raise particularly around the group of also Roma that we work with, groups that we've worked with as colleagues and have met with, but also members of our community who are particularly concerned because of the level of discrimination they face in their countries of origin, and have felt that although in some cases they're also facing discrimination in the UK, their lives have improved greatly in a number of ways, and feel that, you know, the level of fear in that community about their uncertainty and what you might have to, if that means that you have to leave your country if you don't fit and you can't get settled status, what you would have to return to. That's very different, and I think that's a group, in terms of when we talk about groups we need to hear from, I think that's very important. And of course there are Roma who are very successful and will perhaps qualify under these new rules, but there are also people who work in employment that is more agency, employment that is less secure, and kind of proving these kinds of, what have you been, you know, that your earnings are above a certain threshold, and these kinds of things are of a great concern to this community. And another issue that I know is a concern of that community and many others is what my colleague here raised as well, about the how do you apply? What's the actual process? You know, is it all online? What about people who are not comfortable with that? Currently, there's proposed that it will be all online. So there are certain issues around that, and I think we need to really be aware of that there is an attempt, also perhaps in these processes, of a divide and rule between, oh, you know, you're the good migrant, you know, you easily fit these criteria, and that leaves everyone else. Well, actually, I think, you know, that perhaps it will be a majority of the migrants who are here who don't neatly fit into that box, and that's very important. Lastly, my point also on a personal note, I think I'm also very concerned about this period, this blanket period of permission to stay over 2 years, because certainly in that time, how will that be enforced? I think we've seen already the level of discrimination that people are facing and hate crime. So how is that going to be evidenced? You know, how am I going to stay here and enter, leave and enter the country in that time period, or apply for housing or jobs and so on? I think that's a very great concern. And also this idea that if it's not a lifetime guarantee, if it's not enshrined in law and there's an oversight beyond the UK government, how do we know that we don't lose our rights further down the line? Thank you.
A gentleman in front. Alison, just in front.
Hi, my name's Eric Gale, and I'm on the board of, I'm on the board of Disire. And I'm one of the people that Christiane is talking about. I've lived here 37 years, and I've only just managed to find work. Even the work that I'm doing is part-time, and it doesn't quite go up to the threshold of 655, I think it is. It's very worrying for people like myself. If I'm supposed to have this insurance, I mean, who's going to insure me? There's a whole and also as the lady behind me was saying, there is a case of good immigrants and bad immigrants. I've had loads of people who've said to me, it's like, oh no, but it won't affect you. Because I have a reasonably good English. It's bizarre. And also I think the people who we're not kind of touching up are actually the people who do actually care for disabled people professionally. A lot of those do come from the EU, so if all of those people do decide to leave the country, who's going to look after? Possibly not the likes of me, but all the other hundreds of people who do actually need 24-hour care or whatever.
Okay, I'm going to come over to this side of the room, but I'm coming back to you. I'm not leaving you, so don't think you're losing out. So, the gentleman there in that, is that a check shirt? My eyesight, apologies.
I'm Michael, I'm from Lambeth Law Centre. Just to reiterate on some of the groups whose voices aren't being heard, I thought what Christiane said was amazing and really revealing about things, but one group she touched on was third country nationals, so people who are family members of European nationals, and it may be because their families are, their sponsor, as it were, is in having health problems, but also because there may be a relationship breakdown, so women who are victims of domestic violence who are currently able fairly easily to leave those relationships and still have some sort of protection, will have that their voices don't seem to be being heard. Third country nationals, children who are here long term, who are separated from their families, we see quite a lot of those. And the case you were talking about of a child who was born here, 17 years growing up, we're seeing European immigration tribunal decisions which are suggesting that people who we all thought were British nationals, and the Home Office thought were British nationals, the upper tribunal are now suggesting that maybe they're not. So there's those sort of groups of people. And then beyond that, I think the people who do tend to drop through the cracks, people who we're already hearing don't have a right to reside. Well, they do have a right to reside. People don't lose their right to reside because they're homeless. They lose their right to reside because they're not exercising treaty rights. Most of the people whose cases we've taken on that issue have got a right to reside. Some of them are permanent residents. Some of them are people who have been working for years here. And they drop through the cracks the same way as British nationals drop through the cracks, and they're being faced with detention and removal. So it's not a question that people may be put in detention centres. People are in detention centres now already. And finally, just to touch on the point that some people have been raising about data sharing. Obviously there's an issue about it in terms of rights to privacy, but I would make the point that whilst the Home Office seems to find it remarkably easier to data share when it suits them, when a woman is fleeing domestic violence and is trying to establish that her spouse was exercising treaty rights for 5 years and that she would have required permanent residence herself, that seems to be an awful lot more difficult for them to find.
Well made. Coming back to colleagues there's a colleague in that second row from the front, and then there's a colleague behind him.
Thank you very much. My name is Piotr Sadowski. I'm Secretary General of Volunteer Europe, which is a network that aims to achieve more social justice across EU and Council of Europe countries. I just wanted to make two comments in relation to people with disability. There's a really big concern about EU rights on disability, passenger rights, accessibility, when they're being scrutinized as part of 7,000 plus different issues here in UK law, that they're not just treated as red tape, and they're properly scrutinized, because otherwise the impact on disabled people will be hugely disproportionate than on other EU citizens without disabilities. Secondly, lack of access to EU funding will also impact a lot on the disability sector in the UK. And thirdly, there are UK citizens who disabled citizens who rely heavily on personal care and assistance from EU carers. So if they, again, what the gentleman said here, if they were to be forced to leave, the impact on UK citizens will also be tremendous. Thank you.
Some of our work earlier on has been listening to some of those different sectors, both private and public, about the impact of EU workers if they were withdrawn, and what would be the impact on those services. The NHS being one. In terms of local authorities, we heard from the adult social care sector, but also we heard from the private sector. So the British Hospitality and Trade have said this would be a massive. There is no filling the gap of these different sectors, as well as some at the high end in terms of the financial sector, in terms of some of their workers. Colleague there, just that's it. With your leaflet.
Hi. From a personal point of view, I'm a non-EU migrant, first generation. Professionally, I work for Migrants' Rights Network. Just on the question of which voices aren't being heard, echoing some points already, but it'd be good just to reiterate some of those. An obvious one is EU nationals from lower socioeconomic groups. We talked about good migrants, bad migrants. Good migrants generally tend to be, well, the media narrative is from Western Europe, people who are educated, skilled, the kind of people who are on the panel speaking today. Often the people who are bad migrants are people who are lower skilled, working in temporary jobs, food processing, picking fruit, those kind of people who come in and out of employment. So they're an obvious one, and they're obvious because they're disenfranchised, so their voices don't get heard in the media. People who are educated and franchised, generally their voices get to heard more, so that's just a general point. Someone already mentioned Roma, but just a bit of history, they historically were coming here fleeing discrimination. They initially were going through the asylum system. That stopped when they were able to have freedom of movement. Now they're stuck. What are they going to do next? Another one is BAME EU nationals. You know, it's a smaller group, but there's an intersectional approach there. So people who are from EU countries, but who, let's just say, look like me, who've come here, who live in here. I haven't heard many of their voices represented enough. And this one's an obvious why they might not be represented. My children of EU nationals. Their voices are generally harder to get across because they're children, but you know, their experiences of living here as EU nationals and what the future holds for them. And just another point really about languages, and I totally understand why people have used the word second-class and third-class citizens, and I just want to encourage you from my own background, you know, my family had to go through that kind of stuff, jump through the same hoops. You're not second-class citizens, like you're welcome as anyone else. So hope you don't feel, because we didn't like to feel like we were second-class citizens in the same way.
Okay, anybody I've missed in the... Right, is there anything that we want to respond to at the moment? Because I think we're going to come back to these issues. I'm going to try and sum up at the end of some of the bits. I won't do full justice to it, but I think we'll pick up the points. But as I said, we've taken a full transcript.
Can I just, I don't have all the solutions, but I can tell you what we're doing. We've been meeting with the department exiting the EU and the Home Office. We've made it clear that they need to be transparent and to engage with the wider sector, including the migration sector. Because in our view, there's no point them trying to streamline a service and making it easier for EU nationals when loads of migrants in this country find it hard to apply for indefinite leave to remain. So in terms of what we can do as a sector, I think we need to remain united and to criticize that immigration system. We're not complaining that we are going to become migrants. I mean, we work hand in hand with migrants. We think that this immigration system is unfair. So from our point of view, we don't want to be better treated. It's just that the fact of our EU citizenship gives us a certain status, and we don't want to lose that status. So it's in no way criticizing other migrants, but we say that the immigration system needs to be reviewed, full stop. But what we want is not to be treated differently. We just want to keep that status that we've had for years. So I just wanted to clarify that and where we come in.
Okay, shall we move on to... Sorry, Jeanette.
Yes, and thanks for that, but I do thank the last speaker, because what he was identifying is just how complex the situation is, and just what a state the Home Office migration policies and structure is like, and the idea that they are now going to have to take on another system or another layer, it leaves me totally baffled. I mean, I know that our colleague there, Sunder, is something that he's been working on and has written about. And I just think that we cannot underestimate the complexity of the situation. The gentleman talked about black and minority visually being represented in this population from Angola, being French, to living in Finsbury Park. I don't know which discriminatory factor you're going to pick up in that one. Do you see what I mean?
You've got a choice.
The complexity. And just to say, you know, a lot of people, we've heard about children being discriminated. As a school governor, you know, I mean, it isn't for this committee, but every act of discrimination has to be registered and is registered in a school. But it tends to be focused, of course, on those groups that have been subject to discrimination, you know, for as long as we've had, if you like, the Britain has had colonies. So there is a way through this, through our education system, to pick up those issues of discrimination and pick those up as soon as possible.
Let's move to our third section, which is entitled Community Cohesion. Caroline Russell's going to ask a question around that.
So yes, community cohesion, since the EU referendum vote, there has been an increase in racially or religiously aggravated incidents of discrimination that have been reported. We've seen also with the sort of recent terrorism incidents in this country, we've also seen more attention brought to the issue of social cohesion. We have a mayor who is doing as much as he can with the London is Open theme of work that he's doing. But this is a question for Sunder Katwala, which is what practical steps do you think that the mayor could be taking to support social cohesion in London's communities?
Well, thank you very much for the question and the invitation to be here. British Future is a non-partisan think tank and a charity. We're interested in Britain being a confident, welcoming, inclusive society. So there's a lot of work to do on that. And for us, that's about addressing the anxieties that lots of people feel about how we're handling issues of identity, of integration, of immigration, and how we build more confidence in that. In terms of practical steps for the Mayor of London, the appointment of a Deputy Mayor for Social Integration with a team to have a programme, that's a really good foundation for that. And British Future, my organisation, London Citizens, called for that ahead of the mayoral election, just to say, you know, there's a lot of work to do in London. It's the place of most change, most churn, and most confidence about how we've handled that change. But actually it's good for the rest, it's good for London to get those issues right. It's good for the rest of the country to see that although London is the place of most confidence, we do have to roll our sleeves up, make that work, bring about the contact. And what I think London can particularly do is pioneer a new approach to integration and social integration that goes beyond what other cities have done. I think a lot of cities have paid more attention to integration in the last 10 or 15 years. There are good examples in the United States, there are good examples around Europe, and there are things we can learn from. There's also something London can pioneer, which is that when cities have stepped up, there is always a tendency to do integration sort of as if integration is minority and migrant affairs, rather than integration is what brings the city together for migrants, for minorities, for everybody. And I think just the demography of London makes that a chance for us to do that. Because while there are specific issues and challenges, and today we very much focused on the specific issues and anxieties for Europeans of Brexit, clearly a group is affected in a very big way. If we don't link up how we address those issues for Europeans to the everybody agenda, what is fair opportunity in our city? What is a sense of belonging in our city? How does that work for Europeans, for people from different ethnic and faith minorities, for the majority community? If you don't make it an everybody agenda, you haven't really got an integration agenda. And so I think that balance between dealing with the particular challenges and barriers, everything we've heard today, if you haven't got secure status in a country, then your psychological feeling of belonging and integration is incredibly disrupted. But that should be part of an agenda that's about all Londoners, that's about the integration into London of somebody who gets on the train in Newcastle, as well as somebody who gets on the coach in Warsaw and comes to our city. So I think London is in a particular place to do that, and I think it'd be good to look at the challenges we face today for Europeans in that way, because we could also break down these them and us debates. Integration is the minorities versus the majority. It's Muslim integration, or it's immigration and Europeans to do that. And I think London could push at that. Securing your status is an absolutely essential foundation. I think the thing I wanted to say about that is, where could the Mayor of London add value to that? This summer and this autumn, I don't think the added value is going to be in the issues that are currently being debated between the governments now. Between those positions, we can all have a view on that and have the debate, but hopefully we'll see some progress this summer, this autumn, for Christmas, so that we can get on to the other issues and settle this issue. I think the Mayor could add a lot of value in what the big question for 2018 is. Are we going to get a fit-for-purpose system that works? And I think the reason the Mayor of London could add a lot of value is if we're going to get this right, then a third of the people involved are in London. And so the London stakeholders and the contribution they can make is a very, very big part of the national picture. I think there's a convening role there, which is, if it's such a complex issue, and everybody can find so many complexities. Can the mayor help to align the priorities of the people affected themselves, of their employers in the private and the public sector, of the political voices that want to get it right as we move from, in a way, the principles to the actual practicalities of doing this? Don't underestimate that there is some potential here for a shared interest with the government and the Home Office. There is a tension. The Home Office is interested in, control and security and, having a system that's tight. But there's also a pressure, because of the sheer capacity of the scale of what they've got to do, that actually having a more light touch, inexpensive system, not just inexpensive for the applicant, but inexpensive for the government to do simple cases well, would actually let you perhaps do the job in 2 or 3 years. So I think there's a really good convening role there. There's another issue, which is that, as has been said, using online would be good, but online isn't very good for everybody. Can this be localised and personalised? Our own report, the Brexit Select Committee, have said there's a real opportunity to do a lot of cases at a local level. There might be a willingness to do that. There's a big capacity challenge. But I think the mayor could be a very good link between London boroughs and the national government, as other, city regional mayors could be, because otherwise the local and national level aren't going to speak. The use of local nationality checking services who already do something quite like this to sort of see if some cases can be green-lighted would be very good if they got the resources, if they got the skills, if they got the training to do it. If it's dumped on them without the capacity to do it, then it won't work. So I think there's a really good piece of convening there about a constructive potential consensus, how we're going to do the scale of this task. I think it's about a focus on, in a way, the light touch system that would not be onerous for applicants, and then the advice and communication to harder to reach groups and the advice that's needed for difficult groups. I think data sharing can be something to worry about. It's a big part of the answer when the government's already got the information, and they shouldn't be sending either individuals or employers on a sort of 40-year-long paper chase for things that are sitting on the HMRC database. And I think there's an awareness of that. So I just think there's a really constructive, crunchy role in terms of what might the solutions be for doing this, and a brokering of that. Communications is going to be really important. The government doesn't know who these people are. Between them, London stakeholders, boroughs, employers, public sector, private sector, schools, could really help to reach people if they had good advice to communicate. The other point that's come up is communication to people who aren't the people affected is going to be incredibly important if we're not going to see discrimination. So I think there's some real risks of this period and the issues we've been talking about. So about 2 other issues of integration and cohesion. Xenophobia and hate crime. It's wrong and bad and unacceptable for lots of reasons. It's definitely a barrier to integration. It definitely sends you back into sort of going back into your shell and not reaching out. I think there are some important things to do here. Europeans were just not on the radar of what governments talked about in their hate crime strategies. And you look at the one the government produced after the referendum, the timing was all about the referendum and saying something. There wasn't any content about that. So we don't know very much, actually, about the experience of Europeans, what you report, what you don't report. Anecdotally, I think we think that quite a lot of people, maybe from A8 countries, don't think that being abused in the street because you're from foreign is the sort of thing you take to the police. And actually having a really clear message that actually it is something you take to the police and it gets taken seriously by the police, I think would be really good. So I think there's support for groups that actually face abuse. I think there's a really important balanced political message that's needed, which I would sort of sum up, it's sort of vigilance without alarmism. Because we risk, we should be getting the under-reporting of this. We should be getting it out in the open and getting more of it reported. Then we'll see our statistics going up. But we don't want to say, there's xenophobia and racism in London, we're going to deal with it. It's not a xenophobic city. And so we should be really careful about sort of having the welcoming, open message that's very clear. That's why we're dealing with it. And I think the way we handle, the increase in statistics that we'd have if we collected them properly. But there's another really difficult bit, I think, about hate crime that I think we haven't thought about much yet, and xenophobia, which is how are we going to reach potential perpetrators? And that is a different kind of point, and it's a difficult audience to get to. So, support for the groups that were affected. There are some people who put on Facebook, London is open. And, they're not the sort of people who are going to go and, shout at somebody on the tube, I hope, when they've had a drink about what country they've come from. So I think our schools could do a lot. And I think schools are a place where there are problems, but I think schools are probably doing a lot with, 11-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds about what norms are. Schools can place change in places of kindness, I think, where people can get that reassurance. But what do we know? And, hear what the what the mayor and the office do around, you know, messages on public transport and so on. What do we think about that group that probably doesn't sort of really totally buy into the London voted Remain, London's open? What is it that keeps that group knowing what norms of behaviour are, actually, about what you do or don't say? You can have sceptical views about the level of migration, but you actually don't abuse people who are different to you. You know, what is the peer group pressure to not do that, as well as the peer group encouragement to do that? I'm not sure that some civic society groups, I think, have been very good at getting to the very tough end of very tough places. Groups that support victims tend not to do that. And so I think there's some knowledge sharing there. And then finally, contact. You know, in the long term, why is London the place of most confidence when it's got the most diversity? Well, it's the place of most confidence because it's got the most diversity. Because in the end, when you've met people, it works. But how do we have contact with the people who aren't likely to have it, as well as contact with the people who are likely to have it? I think this is the big challenge of social integration. What are the moments when, you know, if you can get that reassuring, surprisingly reassuring contact? I wouldn't have gone, maybe, but actually it was great. And that is a different group from the group that will go to a sort of, you know, something that is celebratory and about contact. What are the moments that do that and how could you do it? I think we saw some of that with the great get-together events that took place. You know, a lot of people who are very sort of pro-openness and diversity would have gone. I think a lot of those things held in different places. But how can we find ways to do that? And I think the use of sport, the use of volunteering, you know, the use of just things where things are going on to engineer contact in a subtle way is quite important. But the other thing I think we could look at is moments that are moments about identity for everybody and that are big moments for most people in London. And how do we work in sort of surprising contact and surprising inclusiveness into that? We've had a lot of positive experiences in the work we've done at British Future with the First World War centenary. And I think you'll see this across the boroughs in London, that there's a real story there about a multi-ethnic and multi-faith Commonwealth contribution that goes back 100 years that some people know about and a lot of people don't know about. And over those 4 years, a lot more people know about that than did. And, you know, not knowing that 400,000 Muslims were in the British Army in World War I and finding out about it kind of makes you feel differently if you're British Muslim. Makes you feel differently, actually, if you're someone who really likes the army and thought Muslims couldn't be British. So I think that's quite important. But the world's changed a lot between August of 2014 and November of 2018, you know, with Donald Trump and with Brexit. And so actually what we were thinking about the centenary and what we do with it at the start and what we should be thinking about at the end, I wonder if November 2018 is quite an important moment to have a message about reconciliation, remembrance, Britain's place in Europe, what that history has been, you know, slightly counterintuitively in a way because of Brexit. Actually, it's quite an important moment to actually express some values about that. And actually that would be a very powerful moment when the whole country is sort of watching something on television, I think, for political actors to bring in some themes that maybe they weren't thinking about and to have a sort of everybody message about inclusion and integration that's multi-ethnic, that's multi-faith, that's British, that's relevant to Europeans who come here as well.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. That was just added enormously. I think the most important thing was that thing of London as a place of change, churn and confidence. And the other thing is that we are all Europeans, and it's just so important that all of us are Europeans but come from different countries within Europe, and just holding on to that while trying to address the issues of integration is just incredibly important, because it's very easy to think of Europeans as other, and that has been very much part of the national narrative, and it's really important that we kind of make sure that the national narrative includes the idea that, you know, we are all Europeans, and actually we European citizens who were born in this country are losing something as well through the Brexit process.
Jeanette Arnold.
Yes, just going back to Sunder and thank him for his presentation. I would just challenge something that you said about London being, in your narrative, it was almost a place of total harmony. I exaggerate. That cannot be the case, certainly not from my experience representing 3 boroughs over 17 years. If that was the case, then we wouldn't have disenchanted and disenfranchised young people. We wouldn't have our education system showing how difficult it is to actually get through our education system get through to degrees if you're from a certain postcode. I'm going off after this meeting to the launch of a paper that shows London has one of the highest dropout rates in our university. And why I'm saying this is I do think we have to recognise that London can be as hostile a place as a lot of cities, and the hostility grows around the other. Once you're designated the other, you are in a different place. And I just go back to Christine's example. Christiane, we've heard some of that experience when we did scrutiny on people with disabilities' access to work and how our system penalised them, have always done. And so I would just say to you, Sunder, that I'm just not with you all the way in terms of that narrative that you give. The city can be, and in places and at times, one of the most hostile and discriminatory cities alongside everybody else.
I think what you say is very, very important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if we don't acknowledge that, we won't deal with the issues. No, London will be a place of anti-Muslim prejudice. It will be a place of Islamist extremism and intolerance against other people. It will be a place of racism. I mean, those will be minority views within all of those communities. But if you experience that in the street, that's very important. So if we don't say that's true, we won't go and address it. In the referendum, London votes, 60-40. It's on one side of the question. That's quite a lot of people on the other side of the question. There'll be a mix of identity, opportunity issues going on there. So it's helpful to remember both views are in all parts of London. And so it's important to deal with it. But so I would be very reluctant to have too exceptionalist a message about London in the national debate. I think if we're heard to be saying London is open, the rest of Britain, you're all oiks, but we'll get on with it because we like, we want to say Britain's going to stay open, London's going to be part of that, we'll deal with the challenges here, we've got prejudice too. So I think the more you normalise the London experience, when the pace of change is fastest. In some ways it's got the most challenges. Comparatively, it's got the most confidence. Scots have an idea that they have a particular confidence about this without the level of change that London has had. And London deals with the most change and has the most confidence. If we roll up our sleeves, do it and don't turn a blind eye to all the problems. And then, of course, it's very important to say those issues of opportunity and inequality and housing pressures and public service pressures are felt by migrants, are felt by minorities, are felt by everybody. And if you drop the ball, then you won't get to have your confidence, and the business leaders and the mayor will find they haven't got the support they want. So I think it's a really helpful message to say, actually, London's just like everyone, we're the same as everyone. It's difficult, it's important, because we've been doing it for generations. We know we can make it when we make it work. It's much more better than saying we get it and the rest of you don't and the rest of you aren't in the modern world.
And just to come back quickly, Chair, it's just to say you talked about the appointment of Matthew Ryder in this really significant position, and we recently obtained evidence from him, and it was interesting that many of the points you raised came through in terms of his agenda. I think maybe we should write to him and say if he's looking at a timeline, 2018 is really just a few months away. Yeah.
Comments and contributions. So we'll start at the back. If we go right to the back and then we'll work our way forward.
My name is Tamara Flanagan. I'm from New Europeans. I just wanted to pick up on Jeanette. I think I can't quite see your name from here's point about othering. And although it's not London specific, we do have London media. And I wanted all of us to be encouraged to challenge the media when they indulge in stereotypes and othering, which they do frequently. I'm not talking about pre-referendum, but now. I understand that the young woman, Concha, who was playing tennis last week, has been accused of not really being a Brit, but Hungarian masquerading as a Brit. This kind of thing is completely unacceptable, and it reinforces the worst kinds of prejudices. And think it's an element. We all talk about the media and its responsibility for Brexit, but it's still going on. And I think in this area of European citizenship, we should pick up the phone, challenge LBC, challenge the BBC, whoever it is, when these kinds of stereotypes are perpetuated.
Thank you.
I think it's a colleague just in... Yep.
Hi, I'm Disire from the Latin American Women's Rights Service. I'm a non-EU migrant, but also affected by Brexit. I wanted to say that if we're talking about inclusion and sense of integration, and it's important to obviously combat narratives, negative narratives around EU migrants in a way that doesn't foster this, dichotomy between good migrants and bad migrants. It's also important to recognize that there are some issues that are already affecting pre-Brexit issues that affect the sense of belonging of a lot of EU migrants and non-EU migrants, especially those working in unregulated areas of the labor market, for instance, and victims or at risk of trafficking and modern slavery. Plenty of people in the construction services, in the construction sector, or in outsourcing services like cleaning, in the case of the Latin American community. So I think that it's important that if we talk about inclusion and sense of belonging, to also accompany those debates with actual enforcement of rights, and in particular of employment rights of those workers.
Okay, anybody else who hasn't spoke yet? I'm going to bring people, so we come this side, if we can come down, and then I'll bring other people in for seconds.
Yes, hello, my name is Monika Tkaczyk. I represent Federation of Poles and Europeans as well. From the 3 years, we very hard work with the was mentioned about the social information, let's say, about what's going to happen when we're going to leave. At the moment, we receive from the Federation, and not only, many questions. What's going to happen? What's going to happen on the businesses? What's going to happen with the family? What's going to happen even with the bank's statements and stuff? Because many of people, the Polish people, they buy houses, they take it a lot of loan and mortgage, and what they don't know what's going to happen if they less as 5 years. And that issue we receive as well about which the case is going on at the moment, about the British passport with the Polish children, with the born, but accidentally was mentioned as from the British government that was accidentally given. They have to review again, and maybe there's a big chance they should contact the Polish embassy. Many other issues, and we, for the last 7 years, we produced the books how to live in the UK, in Great Britain, to support Polish people. And actually, we would like to know how we can support them after. Where is going to be any support for? Because we know we are largest number of the European people in Great Britain. Thank you.
Okay, colleague just in the middle. That's it.
My name is Laura. I'm from the project officer at Law Centers Network, but also a Romanian citizen in London. And I want to touch on, I guess, advice, hidden persons, and integration. I happen to coordinate a project on the integration of EU nationals in the UK, funded by the European Union. And the project has been going on for over a year and a half now. And the project primarily seeks to give advice and information to EU nationals on their EU rights. We wrote this project in 2014, but obviously the project had a refocus on Brexit, since the main issues used to be, say, employment rights and housing rights. Now 67% of one-to-one sessions have been on permanent residence. One-to-one sessions. And so I think this shows not necessarily that, it clearly shows that there is concern simply about existing, living and working in the UK, but not necessarily that employment rights or housing rights or discrimination has been going down. I think there's an erosion of rights, and the most urgent one seems to be permanent residence. And so this is my comment on advice, and I think demand has risen, and partners have seen an increase in people looking for information and advice, and there's still a gap in people understanding what their status is and how they can claim their rights. And I think the uncertainty also is unhelpful. Also, professionals are being, there's capacity building that's happening through the project to professionals who are decision makers and working with EU nationals. And I think that's also something that still needs, additional funds, because yes, it's a complex area, right, to reside, and it's easy to comparative sickness insurance. There are so many really complex legislative changes that decision makers need the support to make those decisions, and especially in a hostile context of people, the habitual residence test, the right to reside, complex cases. I think, that's certainly something that's necessary. And I think in terms of integration, the project has this more grassroots approach, which has worked really well with something called community champions, which enables people who understand very well their communities to become really good points of contact between organizations that provide advice and people who are in communities but are not typically the people who might go themselves and knock on the doors. They need someone who they trust, and they might be those who are more isolated or speak poor English. And this grassroots approach has really enabled the project to reach groups that are not maybe typically served by mainstream services, such as the Roma or third country nationals with a new passport, and people in low-skilled work, in precarious work, and all the other groups that everyone has brilliantly described the barriers they face. So I think there's, I echo all the comments that have been made, and would like to add that, that reaching people needs to be rooted in an understanding of those people being reached, and the approaches, speaking about integration, need to use grassroots organizations, and we're now applying for further funding from the European Union and other funders to continue this, to enable local migrant organizations who are very well trusted by the members of their community to be better skilled at helping them, rather than just building capacity in organizations that people might fear approaching, such as authorities or very specialist advice organizations. Those organizations that might not have the capacity to give always the best advice are usually just really useful in terms of reaching communities who need advice most. So I think that's my
Thank
comment.
You. Can you come round the front and back there? I'm going to take you both.
So Emmy again from New Europeans. I just wanted to say how much it meant to EU citizens when the mayor on the 24th of June made a very strong statement about London being behind EU citizens, and there were some people giving flowers out to EU citizens. That meant a great deal. But since then, it's dried up. So there have been statements, but nothing has been done at all. So I would suggest that the time has come to put some real effort and some really overt support to the EU citizens in London. Today has been a wonderful opportunity to have our voices heard, and I think that again is a very good sign, and it's a wonderful thing. But look, we have all these organizations that we're trying to do our best, but quite frankly, there's too much to do, and we're all running out of money. I'm sure it's the same for everybody, because we simply can't meet the enormous needs that have been created. And I think it is important for London to stand out, because the big cities were more pro-Remain than anywhere else in the country, except for Scotland, of course. And I think they would follow London's example, and if we can work with some of the other cities, that would be even better. But we need to show how it is done, and we need to show that we're not going to go into this business of fighting xenophobia. We need to be in the business of showing a positive strategy, acknowledging the EU citizens and how they're interwoven with these other EU citizens who happen to be British born, and with other people in this country, and how we're actually making a patchwork together, which is what Britain is about, and this is why we work well together. And this is what we have to remind people of, that it is a positive thing, all this immigration and all this collaboration. And then we need to provide this movement of collaboration and positivity with a platform in the media, with a space to be, with ways in which we can gather people into that positive movement. Because quite frankly, that is what is going wrong in this country. Everybody is scared to have these affirmative values. People are hiding, not just EU citizens. Everybody is scared to speak up about it, lest somebody who's xenophobic will put you down. And that's got to change. And we mustn't be afraid. We have a lot of people here who want to do that. Let's find the ways of doing that together.
Okay, can we take the colleague on the end, and then I'll bring you in. Yep, you.
Yeah, just 2 points around on cohesion, and this is not just about EEA nationals. I think we all saw last year the rise in hate crime following the referendum, and we at Migrant Voice held a number of emergency meetings around hate crime and some workshops following that throughout the year, and how to support people in reporting hate crime and how we raise awareness around that. And I know many other organizations who have that more as their core area. Work did a lot more work around that area, and in some areas we find it particularly helpful to work with the police, particularly in the West Midlands. Even though there are issues, some people are concerned about reporting to the police, but it's important to work with the police also in raising that concern and working with third-party reporting centres and grassroots and so on. But I think there's a role there in terms of for MOPAC and the Met and so on, because it would be nice to have more engagement around that, because I'm raising it because I think many organizations and many individuals are concerned that there is going to be more hate crime, and particularly when there is an outcome, when there finally is some kind of solution for EEA nationals. They said now you have your rights. That there will be a backlash in terms of hate crime. The other point is about rhetoric, and it's been made by my colleague Tamara and Emmy about the need to speak in the media. But I think another role is for our political leaders to be seen to use rhetoric that is not scapegoating not just EEA nationals but any migrants, and to really provide leadership in terms of how we talk about migration and the debate on migration. And make sure that we hear migrants' voices in that. But really we also need, in terms of having a good media debate, it also comes from the top, from making sure we have role models and good examples in how we address these issues.
Colleague there.
My name is Nishan. I'm European, I'm Bulgarian. I live in London and I work for Brent Council. Until a couple of weeks ago, I was managing the new and emerging communities program of Brent Council. And needless to say, I met hundreds and hundreds of Europeans and Eastern Europeans. I would like just to mention 3 communities at greater risk at the moment. We mentioned the Roma community, especially the Roma community from Poland, Czech Republic, Romania and Bulgaria. For most of them, I wouldn't say for all of them, but for most of them simply there isn't a way back to their country because there isn't a support network and they've been subject to discriminations for generations and generations. Yeah. The second community is the LGBT community, the European and the Eastern European LGBT community in London. I work for Terence Higgins Trust in the past. For years, the biggest sexual health charity in the UK. They support the gay community. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of gay people from Eastern Europe who escaped practically to the UK. And for all of them, I would say, I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but again, I met so many people working for Terence Higgins Trust. For them, there isn't simply a way back to their country, so we have to find some kind of solution to this problem. And the third community, I wouldn't say community, but again, I met hundreds and hundreds of people from Europe, Europeans, who do not live in London and in the UK permanently, but they own properties, they're home owners, they invested billions and billions and billions of pounds, and they're really very worried and concerned about the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Have I missed anybody? Right, we'll go back. Do you want to respond to any particular point, or are you content?
So one point that I think hasn't come up yet about people's status and the certainty and so on, partly because it's all been about, you know, the principles and will be secured, but something I think that the GLA and the London Mayor could look at. How permanent residence works at the moment if you want to be a citizen. So you get permanent residence, you wait another year, you apply again with a second round with more costs and you become a citizen. I just think where people, it's not the right solution for everybody and people might want it and you've got to have settled status otherwise. If people who've been here 5 years want to go to citizenship and we're going to do 2 or 3 million cases actually, how difficult would it be to design this system so that actually it had an easy, cheap citizenship option while you're there at, you know, at much more like the cost of a first UK passport than at the cost of the, you know, the thousands of pounds of cost of citizenship when you go through the other process. And, you know, I think that's a gettable thing.
Okay.
Just comment on that, because we quite understand the point, and I think from the EU nationals that we're talking to, they may not want to fast track to citizenship. And I think the same issues we've just highlighted, I'm thinking about other migrant communities who are facing, I mean, it's, you know, I've worked with migrant communities in the context of CAB work for over 12 years, and I can tell you how difficult it is to put an application and go through the process and dealing with the Home Office. So the prospect of us as well to be added and have grievances on top of that. I think we need to look, if we are going to look at fast tracking, which is not necessarily what 3 million EU nationals want, well, let's make it better for everyone. So that's the message I think that we need to tell the mayor as well, if he has some form of influence over that.
Okay, we're now on the last session, which is looking at the role of local authorities and the mayor in particular. Now, we've touched on throughout these sessions, I think there's a bit of a call that's being asked of those in authority on a whole host of issues. But let's hear from Carolyn about what's facing EU citizens in Brent, which I suspect is facing in the rest of the London boroughs and in London in general, and what can local authorities do to support EU citizens, but also what's the role of should the role of the mayor be? What would you look for as a local government practitioner to the mayor?
So thank you, and it's been really fascinating. I've learned a lot, which is really going to be helpful for me to take back into my work. Just a few, I thought it might be useful to put Brent in context. We are definitely one of the UK's most diverse and therefore London's most diverse boroughs, of which 20% of our population, certainly of the electorate, are European nationals. And I was quite taken aback to look at what the difference between which different countries are predominantly represented, and I would say all countries obviously are, but the largest group are Romanian. It was Polish, but the Polish community, as the gentleman said, is reducing because obviously the Polish economy is stronger at the moment, and the Polish community has reduced in size. Our second largest community, interestingly, is Portuguese, but a lot of that community come from Brazil, and they are Brazilians who hold a Portuguese passport who have come into the borough. We still do have a large Polish community and then an Italian community. So it's quite interesting to think about the diversity of that community in itself. And as a result, the Council has done a lot of work with Nisha and other colleagues around looking particularly at the East European community and how we can provide more tailored services to the East European community. We started that before Brexit. We genuinely thought that Brexit wouldn't happen, but we did think that we had a need to work more strongly with East European communities, and it did happen, even more so now. And some of the work that we're doing is particularly mapping the services that we can and do provide to all communities, but how we can tailor that more specifically to European communities and European nationals, particularly in our case East European nationals, so that we can provide those people with the support and in some respects the love that we can give in terms of you are wanted, you are needed, and we want you to stay. And I say that some of the statistics are quite extraordinary. So as I say, 20% of our community, 20% of all people who work in the borough are European nationals, 10% of all our doctors are European national. We have a high level of regeneration and construction in the borough. 27% of the workforce in the construction industry in the borough are European nationals. and 10% of the council's own workforce are European nationals. So that, I think, highlights the fact that if people were not here in 2019, then that would be catastrophic for our economy and for our communities and the care that many of those people give. So it's been a really big issue for us, and you know, the leader of the council on day one was out there, high profile, saying people are welcome here, you must stay here, we'll do everything we can to try to protect your rights. So in terms of what can the mayor do now and what can local government do now, we need to definitely be targeting services, and I would say largely through the voluntary and community sector, and do capacity building in European communities with volunteers and champions, as you just mentioned, actually community champions, so that we've got really strong capacity building. We need to be out there, and we've just organised a festival for East European communities. We need to be celebrating the cultures of European communities in our boroughs. So we're giving that message constantly that these are communities that we welcome, that we celebrate, and we want to remain with us. So I think that's a very strong community leadership role that we have. Likewise, hate crime and discrimination, we can't stop on that. Now, it's not just in our borough, European nationals who experience, you know, there are levels of Islamophobia as well, which we are constantly combating. But I was very shocked, a member of our staff who was working on the elections in the referendum, who is Bulgarian and was terribly racially abused, as how dare you sit here working on this referendum, etc. And I have to say, in a place like Brent, I was deeply shocked. So I agree with Jeanette Arnold in the fact that within our communities, while we celebrate diversity, there are some pockets of real racism that we need to combat very, very strongly. I think in terms of, and I do think that the GLA and the mayor has been a strong voice around those issues and should continue to be so. But I wanted to look in terms of what does happen, and so he's got to champion the rights of people to stay. But what's absolutely crystal clear is even if people are able to stay, the future economic needs of this country are not going to be met fully by our own, if you want to call it, Brit workforce. It's just not going to happen. So there's the issue of what do we do post-2019? And I thought there was three particular issues that the mayor should focus on working with London boroughs. And the first is around employment and skills, and really pushing for the devolution of budgets and commissioning responsibilities around employment and skills, and to bring that in, because we have the sector skills body, which are national bodies, but the London economy, as we know, is different than the rest of the country's economy. We shouldn't be commissioning skills and basically of narrow parameters around you're a healthcare professional, so you're commissioned in that way, you work in construction, that's different. We need to be looking at the places that we serve, and we should be commissioning and providing skills services around our growth strategies, our industrial strategies, and the communities that we serve. And so I do think that the mayor should be very strongly pushing the government as a part of a new settlement post-Brexit, that a new settlement where there is a stronger voice at the regional and indeed the local level than there currently is. And that would be one area which I think he should push for strong and full devolution. A couple of people have mentioned EU structural funds, and that's really, really important in terms of the communities that those support. And again, I'm pretty sure the government has basically said we will protect the £8.4 billion nationally. That's quite a lot of money into London. It's currently administered on behalf of the EU, not the UK government. It's administered through the GLA and the Mayor's office and the London boroughs, through London councils. And I think the Mayor needs to strongly push that remains, because Whitehall, no question, will push for that money to go direct from them. So on transport, it will be the Ministry of Transport that says, we'll administer that, we'll do it nationally, and we'll decide what the local priorities and regional priorities are. And I think the Mayor should very, very strongly push for that. Again, that the regional and the local is very much in charge of determining how those structural funds would be spent. And then the final issue, which was mentioned by my colleague on the left here, is the whole issue of a new constitutional settlement. I think the mayor should work with the elected mayors in the other combined authorities around England, and I think they should be working very, very closely together to make sure that they are pushing for a strong voice in any new legislative framework that is adopted post-Brexit. So everybody talks about the centralisation of Europe. Actually, the European Parliament is more respectful of local government than this Parliament. There is a constitutional right and there is a constitutional settlement. So any new legislation that comes out of the European Parliament has to be consulted on with local government. When powers return to the UK, I'm pretty sure that right will go. Now, that is a loss of power. The government have said that they will protect all powers and there will be no losses of power, and I think the mayor should really champion that issue with other mayors and make sure that where there is a change in legislation that impacts at the regional level, that he and the other combined authorities mayors are the first people to be consulted, and the GLA is consulted, and they should themselves consult with the boroughs to ensure that there is one of my concerns is a greater centralisation of power post-Brexit as opposed to what we have currently. So I do think the mayor is, in my view, one of the most important politicians in the UK, the Mayor of London, regardless of who that is, and he should be pushing very, very strongly against the further centralisation of power. And if he does that and he achieves that, then the communities that London represents, which hopefully will still have lots of people from Europe living here, and the other diverse communities we have, will be better served by local decision-making rather than centralised and national decision-making. Thank you.
No, thank you. Jeanette Arnold.
Oh, Caroline, I couldn't agree with you more, Carolyn. I represent London on the Committee of Cities and Regions, and so the point that you've made about our understanding and the European understanding about the power and the worth and the value of cities and regions, I really do think that the EU negotiators would be pushing back and will be with the mayor on the many of the points you've raised. And it's just to say that certainly from everything that the mayor has said and done to date, everything that you've said, I think you'll find a line of action there. But as ever, it's the timeline, I think, that we're up against. And you talked about the work of your leader, but of course there's another influential body in London, and that's London Councils.
Yes.
And I just wanted to know if you were knowing whether there is a sort of London Councils, piece that's been pulled together that would then match what the mayor's doing and what other cities and regions in the country are doing.
Yes, well, let's remember that every local government, I used to be Chief Executive of the Local Government Association, and every representative body has to represent all its members, some of which, in the case of London Councils, will be pro-Brexit, so just needs to be cognizant of that. But yes, of course, London Councils is doing a piece of work at the moment in looking at the impact of Brexit and what local government should be striving for, and London local government should be striving for. My own view is the strongest voice in all of those debates will always be the mayor. And he is the mayor of London, and it's really important that he works and London Councils work with him, and I believe they do work well together, and that continues so that they provide a very strong voice in relation to the negotiations. But I do think he's in a very unique position. I think he's in a stronger position than the mayor of my own city, which is Manchester. I think he's in a much stronger position as the mayor of London.
Thank you.
Okay, contributions from the floor. Anyone want to say anything about what you've just heard? Colleague at the front.
Just say, in terms of the mayor's contribution post-Brexit to EA citizens. I think that an important point was touched on previously as well about streamlining and making it easier regarding rights of residence. For example, one of the things that the government now wants to do is to say those famous 5 years of residency that there has to be, is that if there is a break of over 91 days when someone was job seeking, these people are going to have to show not only that they were receiving JSA, which previously used to be enough for people to show that they were job seeking, but go back and say that they were looking for work actively over that period of time. Now, that obviously creates all sorts of problems for people who didn't know that they would be required to provide that when they were job seeking at the time. And of course, as Sunder said before, it's in everyone's interest that all processes are streamlined, and if the mayor can put some pressure in that respect, that would obviously be a very good thing. And also in terms of cost, there are, at one point, EA applications didn't have any cost attached to them. That's no longer the case. And post-Brexit, and whenever that deadline is, that is likely to, the fees are likely to be hiked up. We have seen many fees for immigration applications being hiked up over the years. That's obviously going to be much harder for people from disadvantaged communities to be able to regularize their status. And the UK is in a different position from many other EA countries, where the application is very low, where the application is very streamlined. So perhaps the mayor should put some pressure into government to make that a reality for people from EA nationals who are here.
Okay. Anybody else? Very quickly, quick contribution. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to give justice to the summing up.
Yeah, just quickly on the mayor's role. I think I'm right in saying that EA nationals voted for the mayor in the mayoral election, so part of his constituency is, EEA nationals. And if Brexit is going to go ahead, which obviously it looks like it is as the process has begun, the mayor should push for greater transparency in, from the government in providing information on what's going on, as well as pushing for, for the government to involve, the regional local governments, and that includes the devolved institutions of which London is a part, as well as Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And through that, the Mayor of London can represent, the people of, broadly the people of London, and hopefully you can have a representative Brexit rather than, an ideological one. Yeah, thank you.
Very good point.
You might think I'm joking, but I'm not. The very best solution to all of this is very simple, which is no Brexit. Because the moment we have no Brexit, all of this goes away. And I would like to think that the mayor takes that seriously and stands up. London, having voted to remain, stands up for the possibility of the Republic of London staying in the EU, and failing that, fighting on our behalf, going to the EU, asking for joint funding between the EU and London to do something really spectacular on behalf of EU citizens. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Nice wish list.
Colleagues, are you content at the moment? And I'm going to sum up and close the meeting.
Yeah.
Sorry, one person at the back. Sorry.
Well, given the population of EU citizens in London and the pressure they're under, as we've heard all afternoon, is there a kind of task force, one person at least, within City Hall who is actually looking into that for the next few years, or a group of persons which, could be a reference point?
Okay, I've got the point. And let me begin. Look, I was very much taken. Someone talked about being suspended in uncertainty. I was very much taken by that phrase, and I can't do anything about that. But what I can do, on behalf of my colleagues and the majority of my colleagues in the London Assembly, is to make sure that your voice is continually heard throughout the coming months, years, to be honest, because this could take some longer time than what people think in terms of where we're going to. So I want to give that commitment. There are a couple of things I do want to do justice of what you've told us, what we've heard today, which I think is important. And I've missed bits, so there's gaps in this, but I don't want you to rest assured, because we'll pick it up through the transcripts, but things like, very basically about, you know, some of the aspects of what's happening in our schools. It almost says we need advice to our schools, professionals, and school governors about their responsibilities for young people and what they may be facing if they're European. And we do it for other groupings. We should be doing that now if we haven't already done so. I've heard about the advice issue generally, but there are specific issues around employment, around mental health, around some of the issues of general rights, the myths that are developing that need to be righted. Do you know what I mean? We have not left the EU yet. We are all EU citizens. We need to remind that where people are in their circumstances are very much taken by the data sharing, but also taken by, there is a positive way of using data as well. There's a non-positive way, but the barriers of that, of stopping people accessing services, would cause me a great concern, but it's real. And I suspect that's real, and we've got to try and do and work hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. Speaking up and finding the voice, as described as the scandal, I can't disagree with that word. The circumstances that people find themselves in, not of their own individual actions, but of what took place, and then thinking, without thinking through where the consequences are, and then being involved in or watching negotiations take place, which I really don't have much influence over, but we're battling for our influence, or we will work together on that to try and make sure that we can try and influence those who do it. We will do some more work around the working persons issues and this design issue, which I think, look, you know, if we wait for government to do this, we need to help hold hands and design systems. If the existing immigration system is chaotic and not working, what hope have we got of adding to it? And so certainly we ought to think about the people that are involved in it at the sharp end, i.e. EU, the next it will be the EU citizens. What can we do to minimise those issues and try to help that? I think we can talk about that further, and we need to talk further with my colleagues. Appropriate resources and different models of delivery in the interim. I heard that very strongly, and I think we have to look at some of those issues around that advice and some of those issues. I take it about online not good enough, but also about who are we talking to in terms of our groups. What I take from this also, you know, there's a bad side to the referendum, a good side to the referendum. I suspect there are people talking to each other now in networks that probably never spoke to each other and never thought that they had nothing in common.
That's right.
In terms of their own ways. And we, you know, and by that we are stronger, albeit in a very challenging, and it doesn't look like, you know, we are the David to the Goliath of whatever that is. Do you know what I mean? In its many forms and shapes. So I think I take that point. On terms of the funding issues, we been ahead of this. On the structural funds, we raised it at one of our very first meetings when we had reports about structural funds, trying to get the mayor, and we are still lobbying for this, to start thinking, what would a London structural fund look like? Yeah. What are they? And shouldn't we start now talk to government about that? Because if we leave, that some of that money needs to be put to that. And equally, we've got a real issue about ESF funding, because that's the principal funder of our voluntary sector and support groups. I think the gentleman referred to help to disabled groups. ESF there is a strong component around the health community-led sector, voluntary sector within London, and we need to start that. Our next meeting in October of this panel, we're trying to get Michael Wesseltine along, who's a former cabinet minister, former deputy prime minister, who's been involved in creating grant regimes. He was on the Remain side of the debate, but we think it would be quite useful to bring him in to talk about what funding streams should be like post-Brexit, if that's where we are, start working some of those issues up. So we're starting to talk about those and thinking about how we can do it. What takes place at local level, I think we really have to do some more thinking about that. I almost certainly I want to move on that. On the hate crime issue, there's a couple of things that I'm going to do now. So when we talk about the next steps from this meeting, these are only mine as the chair, but I know will be endorsed by my colleagues because I know their thinking and style on this. But there's going to be a further conversation in the London Assembly. So we'll pick up on the last points around the role of the mayor and where it is. So what's going to happen here? So we've got a new way of working. So we're a scrutiny body, and I should tell you, we also work with our colleagues involved in scrutiny of the executive of the Scottish Parliament and in the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Ireland Assembly. Slightly different in the Northern Ireland Assembly because the way the politics is there, it's not in operation, but the civil service is still operating, and we are sharing and working with them with our desired hope that they will come back into being once they resolve some of their very important issues, so they become a devolved body. We will share this work with them. We will spread this work out far and wide. We will work with them, and we know they're in contact with their own executives because they want to influence their executives talking to national government about these issues. We will, I think, be writing a letter to the mayor. It'll be a very long letter to the mayor because I want to try and do justice to what we've heard today, but setting it out in a way that he can take some of the points and hopefully him and his officials and his deputy mayor, Matthew Ryder, has been spoken out as quite important, but it's very early stages of this work that we're doing in the GLA, but we wish it well, but this has got to be an important aspect and part of that work at the early stages and see if we can influence that. On hate crime, I very much believe you, unless it's reported, right, we are not going to register. And I suspect there's been a lot of hate crime, albeit I do believe the majority of Londoners are tolerant and welcoming, but there's been some, and I don't think we're getting it reported. And it's because people don't think in this, back home, would not be reported or taken seriously in the way that it should. And I think I want to immediately write to the mayor, alerting him to this, the deputy mayor, but also to Cressida Dick, alerting her to this issue and saying what steps are the police going to do through their networks to get out about what the position of us around hate crime is, and encouraging people, and I urge you to use your networks to report issues of hate crime. And if you're uncertain about what you think hate crime is, we can provide you with that information, and we should do as an utmost piece of sense of urgency. I do think we want to write to London councils, and I think, you know, I very much share your sentiments of where you are. I understand the nature of it. London councils is the body that brings all local government together from the boroughs. It represents all parties. Some would have wanted to leave Europe, some would have wanted to remain. But the question is, it's quite important that we get that debate started at London councils and try to cascade it down to local level, because, you know, there are, as we know, you know, I don't want to make a political point, but lots of Conservatives who wanted to remain. We need to reach out to some of those in some of those areas where it may well be not the view of the council. I'd expect there's only a few. But I think we need to do that course of action almost like very soon. And I don't want to wait until September. We're still working in August because we're still catching up on the backlog. I really would like these to go out as a matter of urgency over in the coming weeks. I know that's a tough timetable for officials, but that's what I think the panel would like to go on the immediate issues we're going to do. And then we should look at other opportunities of working together on some of these issues again, because there may well be some specific issues. It may not be us as Assembly members, but there may well be bringing people together. We have worked, and we certainly have been working, as I said before, with employers' groups. I'm conscious about that unregulated market. It's a really tough one because it's a zone where if you complain, you get in trouble, you lose your job, you lose access to the small monies that you get, but equally, there are rights that exist, and if we can encourage people to do that, we might expose some of those people that are taking the disadvantage of people and their circumstances. We need to think sensitively about it, but we do need to do it. It's a bit like reaching out into the hard-to-reach communities. So that's my starter for 10. So the other action I'm going to do is go away and talk to some of my colleagues, including not just members of this panel, but try and engage the other 25 members of the Assembly of those who want to engage on this topic. And there is a majority. I want to assure you of that, that there is a majority, and it's quite a healthy majority that want to, who are maybe not touched, who can't experience what you've experienced or the feelings you've experienced, but do understand that actually it is not right in terms of where we are. So we're on the right side of the debate, and that's the important thing for me in terms of taking this issue forward. Can I thank you all in the way that you've spoken this afternoon? If there's anybody that wants to follow up and engage and thinks we've not quite picked up on a point, then please come back to us. You've got our contacts. And certainly thank you to the sort of New Europeans grouping, because you played a key part to that. I want to thank our staff. I think particularly, you know, senior officials apart, they're always doing it, but Gracie, who coordinated some of the work on our side, I want to thank her for her work in putting this together this afternoon. And certainly, you know, it's been a very important meeting for us here at the GLA, and I need to make sure that it gets out far and wide. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound.